In 1848, the United States of America forced Mexico to sign a treaty that transferred over 500,000 square miles of territory, more than half of Mexico's entire landmass, for the bargain price of $15 million. That's roughly 29 cents per acre. For context, that's less than what you'd pay for a candy bar today. That territory included all of present-day California, Nevada, and Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, significant chunks of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma, the land that would eventually become home to Los Angeles, San Francisco, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Denver, and dozens of other major American cities. Before the war, the western border of the United States was roughly where Texas ended. After the war, it stretched all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The country had grown by nearly a third in a conflict that lasted less than 2 years. And here's the uncomfortable truth that most American history textbooks dance around. The Mexican-American War was, by almost any honest assessment, a war of naked territorial aggression. It was started under false pretenses, conducted with overwhelming force against a weaker nation, and concluded with a treaty that many contemporaries, including a young congressman named Abraham Lincoln, considered little better than armed robbery. General Ulysses S. Grant, who fought in the war as a young lieutenant and would later become one of America's greatest military heroes, wrote in his memoirs that the Mexican-American War was one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. He called it an instance of a republic following the bad example of European monarchies. This is the story of how the United States took half of Mexico. It's a story of ambition and conquest, of heroes and villains on both sides, of political machinations that make modern politicians look like amateurs. It's also a story that shaped the borders, the demographics, and the destiny of North America in ways that still echo today. It begins, as so many American conflicts do, in Texas. To understand how the United States and Mexico ended up at war, you need to understand the powder keg that was Texas in the 1830s and 1840s. Texas had been part of Mexico since Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1821. But Mexico had a problem. The northern territories were vast, sparsely populated, and constantly threatened by Comanche raids. The Mexican government needed settlers, and it didn't have enough of its own people willing to move to such a dangerous frontier. So Mexico made a decision that seemed practical at the time, but would prove catastrophic. It invited American colonists to settle in Texas. The deal was simple. Americans who agreed to become Mexican citizens, convert to Catholicism, and swear loyalty to Mexico would receive generous land grants, far more acreage than they could ever hope to afford in the United States. Thousands of Americans, mostly from the southern slave states, jumped at the opportunity. By 1835, there were roughly 30,000 American settlers in Texas, compared to only about 4,000 Mexicans. The demographic balance had shifted so dramatically that Texas was essentially an American colony operating under the nominal authority of Mexico City. And then the American settlers did what American settlers often did in the 19th century. They decided they didn't want to be governed by anyone but themselves. The immediate trigger was Mexican President Antonio López de Santa Anna's consolidation of power and his move to centralize the Mexican government. The American Texans, along with some Mexican allies who opposed Santa Anna's authoritarian tendencies, declared independence in 1836. What followed was the Texas Revolution, a short, brutal conflict that produced two of the most famous moments in American frontier mythology, the Siege of the Alamo and the massacre at Goliad. The Alamo doesn't need much introduction. It's been mythologized so thoroughly that separating fact from legend is almost impossible. What matters for our story is this. In March 1836, a small garrison of Texan defenders held out for 13 days against Santa Anna's army of several thousand soldiers. When the Mexican forces finally breached the walls, they killed virtually every defender, somewhere between 180 and 260 men, depending on the source. Among the dead were Jim Bowie, the knife fighter, Davy Crockett, the frontier legend, William Barrett Travis, who had sworn to never surrender. Their deaths became a rallying cry, "Remember the Alamo." Less well-remembered, but arguably more important, was what happened at Goliad a few weeks later. After the Battle of Coleto, approximately 400 Texan prisoners of war were executed on Santa Anna's orders, shot in groups, their bodies left for the vultures. The Goliad massacre horrified public opinion in the United States and transformed the Texas Revolution from a local rebellion into an international cause célèbre. 6 weeks after the Alamo fell, Sam Houston's ragtag Texan army caught Santa Anna by surprise at the Battle of San Jacinto. The battle lasted 18 minutes. The Mexicans were routed. Santa Anna himself was captured the next day, hiding in a marsh, wearing a private's uniform in a failed attempt to avoid recognition. Texas was free, or at least it declared itself free. Mexico never officially recognized Texas independence, and the question of where Texas actually ended remained hotly disputed. Texas claimed its southern border was the Rio Grande. Mexico insisted it was the Nueces River, about 150 miles to the north. Between those two rivers lay a strip of territory that both nations claimed, and that strip would eventually become the match that lit the fuse of war. For nearly a decade after San Jacinto, Texas existed as an independent republic, the only state to ever enter the American Union as a formerly sovereign nation. The Lone Star Republic had its own president, its own Congress, its own currency, and its own profound financial problems. Texas wanted to join the United States. That was the whole point. Really? The American settlers who had started the revolution had always envisioned eventual annexation. But the United States wasn't sure it wanted Texas. The problem was slavery. Texas was a slave territory. Adding it to the Union would tip the delicate balance between free and slave states that had been maintained since the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Northern abolitionists opposed annexation with religious fervor. Southern slaveholders demanded it with equal intensity, and presidents from Andrew Jackson onward kicked the can down the road, unwilling to touch such a politically radioactive issue. Meanwhile, Britain was making friendly overtures to Texas. British diplomats suggested that an independent Texas, allied with the British Empire, could serve as a buffer against American expansion and a potential market for British goods. Some British officials even floated the idea of helping Texas abolish slavery, a prospect that terrified the American South. The thought of a British-aligned, potentially abolitionist Texas sitting on America's southwestern border was intolerable to Southern Democrats. Something had to be done. Enter James K. Polk. James Knox Polk was not supposed to be president. When the Democratic Convention of 1844 deadlocked between Martin Van Buren and Lewis Cass, Polk emerged as a dark horse compromise candidate, the first true dark horse in American presidential history. He was so obscure that when news of his nomination reached Washington, the Whig reaction was reportedly, "Who is James K. Polk?" But Polk knew exactly who he was and exactly what he wanted. He was a disciple of Andrew Jackson, a Tennessee slaveholder, and a true believer in what would soon be called manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was ordained by God and history to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, absorbing everything in between. Polk ran on the most aggressively expansionist platform in American history to that point. He wanted Texas, he wanted Oregon, he wanted California, and he was willing to risk war with both Britain and Mexico to get them. He won, barely. The margin in New York, the state that decided the election, was barely 5,000 votes. But a win was a win, and Polk interpreted his narrow victory as a mandate for continental expansion. Before Polk even took office, the outgoing President John Tyler pushed through a joint resolution annexing Texas. The resolution passed Congress in February 1845, and Texas officially became a state in December of that year. Mexico was furious. The Mexican government had warned repeatedly that annexation would mean war. When it happened, Mexico broke off diplomatic relations with the United States and began preparing for conflict. But Polk didn't want to negotiate. Polk wanted a war. And he was about to manufacture one. In the summer of 1845, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to march his army into the disputed territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. This was land that Mexico had never ceded, land that even Texas's claim to was dubious at best. By any reasonable interpretation of international law, Polk was ordering American troops into Mexican territory. Taylor established a camp on the northern bank of the Rio Grande, directly across from the Mexican city of Matamoros. He built a Fort Texas, later renamed Fort Brown, and aimed his cannons at the town. The message was unmistakable. The United States was daring Mexico to do something about it. For months, the two armies stared at each other across the muddy waters of the Rio Grande. Tension simmered. Patrols from both sides probed the disputed territory. Everyone knew a spark could ignite a conflagration at any moment. Meanwhile, Polk was playing a double game in Washington. He had sent a diplomat, John Slidell, to Mexico City with an offer to purchase California and New Mexico for up to $40 million and to assume Mexico's debts to American citizens. It was, on paper, a diplomatic mission, but Slidell's instructions made clear that Polk expected the mission to fail. The Mexican government was politically incapable of selling half its territory to the gringos. Any president who agreed to such terms would be overthrown within days. Polk knew this. He sent Slidell not to negotiate, but to create a paper trail showing that the United States had tried diplomacy before resorting to force. When Slidell was refused an audience with the Mexican president, Polk had his excuse. Mexico had insulted the United States. War was now justifiable, but Polk still needed something more tangible. He needed blood. On April 25, 1846, a Mexican cavalry force crossed the Rio Grande and ambushed an American patrol. 11 American soldiers were killed, 5 more wounded, and the rest captured. It was the incident Polk had been waiting for. When news reached Washington, Polk immediately drafted a war message to Congress. Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, he declared, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon the American soil. This was, to put it bluntly, a lie. The territory where the skirmish occurred was disputed at best and Mexican at worst. American blood had been shed on American soil only if you accepted the most aggressive possible interpretation of where American soil ended, an interpretation that even many Americans rejected. But Polk's framing was politically brilliant. He wasn't asking Congress to declare war over a boundary dispute. He was asking Congress to respond to an act of aggression, to defend American honor, to avenge American dead. What congressman could vote against that without being branded a coward and a traitor? The war resolution passed the House 174-14 and the Senate 40-2. Many who voted yes did so reluctantly, knowing they were being manipulated but unable to resist the political pressure. Among the skeptics was a freshman Whig congressman from Illinois who would become far more famous in later years. Abraham Lincoln introduced his spot resolutions, demanding that Polk identify the exact spot where American blood had been shed and prove that it was actually American soil. Lincoln's resolutions went nowhere. They were ignored by the Democratic majority and mocked by the pro-war press, which nicknamed him Spotty Lincoln, but they reflected a genuine unease about how the war had started. The opposition would only grow as the war progressed. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison denounced the conflict as a slaveholders' conspiracy to expand slavery into new territories. Henry David Thoreau refused to pay his taxes in protest and wrote his famous essay Civil Disobedience while briefly jailed for his stance. Even some military officers harbored private doubts about the justice of their cause. But for now, the war machine was rolling, and nothing could stop it. Mexico entered the war with several apparent advantages. Its army was larger than America's. Its soldiers were fighting on home territory, with shorter supply lines and familiar terrain. And Mexico had a proud military tradition stretching back to its War of Independence from Spain, but appearances were deceiving. The Mexican Army of 1846 was a hollow force, impressive on paper but rotting from within. The enlisted men were mostly conscript peasants and criminals pressed into service, poorly trained, poorly fed, and poorly motivated. Many didn't understand why they were fighting or whom they were fighting for. Desertion was endemic. Discipline was maintained through brutality rather than esprit de corps. The officer corps was arguably worse. Mexican officers were almost universally political appointees, men who owed their commissions to connections rather than competence. They spent more time scheming against each other than planning military operations. Rivalry between generals was so intense that coordinated action was nearly impossible. And then there was the equipment. Mexican artillery was outdated. Mexican muskets were older still. Mexican logistics barely existed. Armies were expected to live off the land, which meant they either starved or alienated the civilian population through plunder. The American Army, by contrast, was a small but professional force. The officer corps included West Point graduates who had studied Napoleonic tactics and trained together for years. The enlisted men were volunteers and regulars who generally knew which end of the rifle to point at the enemy. American artillery, in particular, was state-of-the-art mobile field guns that could devastate enemy formations with terrifying efficiency. The technological gap wasn't enormous, but it didn't need to be. What mattered was that every American advantage training, leadership, logistics, firepower multiplied the others. And when the two armies finally met in battle, the results were devastating. General Zachary Taylor was not a military genius. He was, by most accounts, a competent but unimaginative commander who relied more on the quality of his troops than on brilliant strategy. He dressed like a farmer, swore like a soldier, and led from the front with a courage that his men adored. His nickname was Old Rough and Ready, and it suited him perfectly. On May 8, 1846, before the declaration of war had even reached the front, Taylor's army encountered a Mexican force at Palo Alto, about 12 miles north of the Rio Grande. The Battle of Palo Alto was primarily an artillery duel, and it demonstrated immediately what kind of war this would be. The American guns were lighter, more mobile, and more accurate than their Mexican counterparts. They fired faster and hit harder. Mexican infantry formations, drawn up in the traditional European style, were shredded by canister and shell. The grass of the prairie caught fire from the muzzle blasts, and the battle was fought through drifting walls of smoke and flame. By evening, the Mexicans had retreated. American casualties were minimal. Mexican losses were severe. The next day, Taylor pursued. At Resaca de la Palma, he caught the retreating Mexicans in rough terrain that neutralized their numerical advantage. The fighting was chaotic and close quarters, with American dragoons charging directly into Mexican artillery batteries and infantry clearing the brush with bayonets. The Mexican army broke. Soldiers fled across the Rio Grande in panic, drowning in the current, throwing away their weapons. The Mexican commander, General Mariano Arista, lost control of his forces entirely. In 2 days of fighting, Taylor had effectively destroyed the Mexican army of the north. The road to the Mexican interior lay open. News of the victories at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma electrified the United States. Newspapers ran triumphant headlines. Recruiting offices were swamped with volunteers eager to share in the glory. Mexico or death became a popular slogan among young men who had never experienced war and had no conception of what death actually looked like. Polk was delighted, but he was also concerned. Zachary Taylor was a Whig, and Whig generals who won famous victories had an inconvenient habit of becoming Whig presidents. William Henry Harrison had ridden his victory at Tippecanoe all the way to the White House. Polk had no intention of allowing Taylor to do the same. So even as Taylor consolidated his conquests in northern Mexico, Polk began planning a second, parallel campaign, one that would be led by a general more politically reliable, aimed at objectives more strategically decisive. California was the prize Polk wanted most, the magnificent harbors of San Francisco and San Diego, the fertile valleys and the rumored mineral wealth. The coastline that would finally make America a two-ocean power. And California, in the summer of 1846, was practically undefended. The Mexican garrison was tiny. The Mexican-Californian population was sparse and ambivalent about rule from distant Mexico City. American settlers were already filtering in, encouraged by expansionists who dreamed of a repeat of the Texas playbook. It was ripe for the taking. All it needed was someone to take it. The conquest of California was less a military campaign than a series of opportunistic land grabs carried out by a motley collection of naval officers, army explorers, and irregular volunteers who sometimes cooperated and sometimes worked at cross purposes. The most colorful figure in this chaotic conquest was John C. Fremont, an Army topographical engineer whose previous claim to fame was mapping expeditions to the Rocky Mountains. Fremont was ambitious, reckless, and blessed with a genius for self-promotion. He was also, conveniently, the son-in-law of Senator Thomas Hart Benton, one of the most powerful expansionists in Washington. In the spring of 1846, Fremont was in California with a small party of armed men, ostensibly on a scientific expedition. When word arrived that war had broken out, word that actually preceded the official declaration, Fremont decided to take matters into his own hands. On June 14, 1846, a group of American settlers, encouraged by Fremont, seized the town of Sonoma and proclaimed the independent Bear Flag Republic. The flag they designed, featuring a grizzly bear and a star, would eventually become the state flag of California. The republic they proclaimed would last less than a month. Within weeks, American naval forces under Commodore John Sloat arrived at Monterey, the capital of Mexican California. Sloat raised the American flag, claimed California for the United States, and effectively ended the Bear Flag Republic before it had accomplished anything. Fremont, not to be outdone, merged his irregulars with the American military forces and continued campaigning through the summer and fall. By January 1847, California was firmly in American hands. There had been some fighting skirmishes at San Pasqual and La Mesa, a brief siege at Los Angeles, but nothing that seriously threatened the outcome. The vast territory that would become America's most populous state had been conquered with minimal effort and minimal bloodshed. The real war was being fought elsewhere. While California fell with relative ease, the heart of Mexico remained defiant. The government in Mexico City refused to negotiate, refused to surrender, and refused to accept that the loss of a few border skirmishes meant the loss of the war. If the Americans wanted Mexico to submit, they would have to come and take it. General Zachary Taylor was happy to oblige. In September 1846, Taylor marched his army south from the Rio Grande deeper into the Mexican state of Nuevo Leon. His objective was Monterey, a fortified city nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains, a natural defensive position that the Mexicans had spent months preparing. The Battle of Monterey, fought over 3 days in late September, was the bloodiest engagement of the war so far. The city was defended by approximately 10,000 Mexican troops under General Pedro de Ampudia, dug into fortified positions on the surrounding heights and barricaded within the city streets. Taylor attacked from multiple directions. On the western approach, a division under General William Worth fought its way through the outer defenses, capturing key positions despite fierce resistance. On the eastern side, Taylor's main force assaulted fortified buildings that the Mexicans had turned into miniature fortresses. The fighting in the city itself was brutal. American soldiers advanced house by house, using pickaxes and crowbars to smash through walls rather than expose themselves to fire in the streets. Mexican defenders contested every block. Artillery dueled at point-blank range. The dead piled up in doorways and courtyards. After 3 days, with his ammunition running low and his defensive positions crumbling, Ampudia requested terms. Taylor, whose own army had suffered over 500 casualties and was in no shape for continued street fighting, agreed to let the Mexican army withdraw with their weapons and flags. He granted an 8-week armistice. It was a decision that would come back to haunt him. When news of the armistice reached Washington, President Polk was furious. He hadn't sent Taylor into Mexico to negotiate generous terms with the enemy. He had sent him to crush them. An 8-week pause gave Mexico time to reorganize, to reinforce, to continue the war that Polk wanted finished. Polk's suspicions about Taylor's political ambitions were also growing. Every victory made the general more popular back home. Whig newspapers were already floating Taylor's name as a potential presidential candidate. The last thing Polk wanted was to hand the 1848 election to his political opponents on a silver platter of military glory. So Polk made a fateful decision. He would open a second front of direct assault on Mexico City itself, led by a different general. Taylor would be left in northern Mexico with a reduced force, his role diminished, his chances for further glory curtailed. The general chosen to lead the Mexico City campaign was Winfield Scott, the commanding general of the United States Army and the most experienced military officer in the country. Scott was everything Taylor was not: formal, meticulous, vain, and brilliant. His nickname was Old Fuss and Feathers because of his obsession with proper uniforms and military protocol. Scott was also a Whig, which might seem like a problem for Polk's political calculations. But Scott was so pompous and so politically tone-deaf that Polk apparently calculated he would never translate military success into electoral victory. Taylor was the dangerous one, a plain-spoken man of the people who reminded voters of Andrew Jackson. Scott reminded them of a peacock. The plan Scott developed was audacious. He would land an army at Veracruz, on Mexico's Gulf Coast, and march inland along the route that Hernan Cortes had taken 3 centuries earlier when he conquered the Aztec Empire. It was approximately 260 miles from the coast to Mexico City through mountains, jungles, and hostile territory. Napoleon's generals would have called it madness. Scott called it the only way to win the war. But before Scott's campaign could begin, Taylor had one more battle to fight, and it would be the defining moment of his military career. When Polk stripped Taylor's army to provide troops for Scott's expedition, he left the general dangerously exposed in northern Mexico. Taylor had perhaps 5,000 men, many of them untested volunteers, holding positions around Monterrey and Saltillo. The Mexican government saw an opportunity. If they could destroy Taylor's weakened force, they might turn the tide of the war. A decisive victory would rally Mexican morale, embarrass the Americans, and potentially force a negotiated peace. The man chosen to deliver that victory was Antonio López de Santa Anna, yes, the same Santa Anna who had been defeated and captured at San Jacinto a decade earlier. Santa Anna was the most remarkable political survivor in Mexican history, a man who had been president 11 different times and who seemed incapable of staying out of power, no matter how many disasters he presided over. In 1846, Santa Anna had been living in exile in Cuba when Polk made one of the strangest decisions of his presidency. Polk allowed Santa Anna to pass through the American naval blockade and return to Mexico, apparently believing Santa Anna's promises that he would negotiate a quick end to the war once back in power. It was a spectacular miscalculation. Santa Anna returned to Mexico, seized control of the government, and immediately began preparing the largest military offensive of the war, not to negotiate peace, but to crush the invaders. By February 1847, Santa Anna had assembled an army of approximately 20,000 men and marched them north through the desert in winter, heading directly for Taylor's position. The armies met on February 22nd to 23rd, 1847, at a mountain pass called Buena Vista, or, as the Mexicans called it, La Angostura, the narrow place. Taylor's position was strong but not impregnable. The pass funneled any attacking force through rough terrain, limiting the advantage of Santa Anna's numerical superiority. But the Americans were still outnumbered nearly 4-1, and many of Taylor's troops had never been in combat. Santa Anna opened the battle with a demand for surrender, promising to treat prisoners humanely if Taylor capitulated. Taylor's response became legendary. "Tell him to go to hell," he reportedly said, though the official reply was somewhat more diplomatic. What followed was 2 days of the most desperate fighting of the entire war. Santa Anna threw wave after wave of infantry at the American positions. At several points, the Mexican attacks broke through, sending American volunteers fleeing in panic. The battle seemed on the verge of becoming a rout. Taylor himself rode among his men, rallying them, his calm demeanor under fire becoming the stuff of instant legend. At the critical moment, American artillery saved the day. Captain Braxton Bragg, the same Braxton Bragg who would later become one of the most controversial Confederate generals of the Civil War, commanded a battery that delivered devastating fire into the Mexican formations at point-blank range. When Taylor supposedly ordered him to give them a little more grape, Bragg responded with canister that shredded the attacking columns. By nightfall on the second day, Santa Anna had had enough. He had lost between 1,500 and 3,500 men. Depending on the source, the Mexican records were never reliable. His army was exhausted, demoralized, and running low on supplies. In the middle of the night, Santa Anna ordered a withdrawal, abandoning the field to the Americans. Buena Vista was Taylor's masterpiece. Outnumbered, outgunned, and operating at the end of a tenuous supply line, he had held his ground against everything Mexico could throw at him. The victory made him a national hero and, just as Polk had feared, a presidential contender. But Buena Vista was also the last major battle of the Northern Campaign. The war would be decided elsewhere. On March 9, 1847, Winfield Scott's invasion force appeared off the coast of Veracruz, the largest amphibious landing in American history up to that point. Approximately 12,000 soldiers, transported by a fleet of nearly 200 ships, prepared to storm Mexico's most important Gulf port. The landing itself was practically unopposed. The Mexican garrison, knowing they were hopelessly outnumbered, had withdrawn into the fortified city, hoping to hold out until yellow fever season arrived. Veracruz was notorious for the vomito negro, yellow fever that killed foreigners with terrifying efficiency. If the Mexicans could delay the Americans long enough, disease would do what their army could not. Scott understood the danger. He had perhaps 6 weeks before the fever season began in earnest. Every day mattered. Rather than attempt a costly direct assault on Veracruz's formidable walls, Scott opted for a siege. American artillery and naval guns pounded the city relentlessly, day and night. Shells crashed into churches, homes, and hospitals. Civilians died alongside soldiers. The bombardment was brutal, indiscriminate, and effective. After 4 days, Veracruz surrendered. Scott had his base of operations. Now came the hard part, the march to Mexico City. The route from Veracruz to Mexico City climbs from the tropical coastal lowlands through temperate mountain valleys and up to the high central plateau where the capital sits at over 7,000 feet elevation. The road, such as it was, wound through passes that a determined defender could hold against an army. Santa Anna, having failed at Buena Vista, had hurried south to organize the defense of the capital. He positioned his army at Cerro Gordo, a mountain pass about 50 miles inland from Veracruz, where the terrain seemed to favor the defense. The main road ran through a narrow defile, overlooked by fortified heights. It was, Santa Anna believed, impregnable. Scott took one look at the Mexican position and decided he wasn't going to attack it head-on. Instead, he sent his engineers, including a young captain named Robert E. Lee, to find a way around. Lee spent days scouting the rough terrain north of the Mexican line, crawling through ravines and scrambling up ridges, often within earshot of Mexican sentries. He found what he was looking for, a path through the wilderness that would allow the Americans to outflank the entire defensive position. On April 18, 1847, Scott attacked. While a diversionary force demonstrated against the Mexican front, the main American assault came from the flank, exactly where Santa Anna had thought no attack was possible. The Mexicans, caught completely off guard, broke and ran. Santa Anna himself fled so hastily that he left behind his wooden leg, which American soldiers captured as a trophy. The Battle of Cerro Gordo cost Mexico approximately 1,200 killed and wounded, plus another 3,000 captured. American casualties were roughly 400. The road to Mexico City was open. Scott pressed on, racing the calendar as much as the enemy. His army climbed into the mountains, leaving the fever zone behind, reaching the city of Puebla in mid-May. There, Scott made a decision that his critics would call reckless and his admirers would call bold. He cut his own supply line. Maintaining communications with Veracruz would have required garrisoning every town along the route, dividing his force and leaving detachments vulnerable to guerrilla attacks. Instead, Scott decided to abandon his connection to the coast entirely. His army would advance on Mexico City without reinforcement, without resupply, living off the land and whatever they could purchase from the local population. The Duke of Wellington, monitoring the campaign from England, reportedly declared that Scott was lost and that his army would be destroyed in the interior of Mexico. The old conqueror of Napoleon could not imagine how any general could succeed so far from his base, with hostile territory on every side. But Scott wasn't Napoleon's enemy. He was fighting the Mexican army of 1847, and that made all the difference. For 3 months, Scott waited at Puebla, gathering strength for the final push. Reinforcements trickled in not through Veracruz, which was now too dangerous due to yellow fever, but overland through northern Mexico. By August 1847, Scott had assembled approximately 14,000 effective troops. Santa Anna, meanwhile, had been frantically preparing the defense of Mexico City. He had gathered perhaps 30,000 soldiers, built fortifications around the capital, and positioned his forces to block every approach. Whatever his faults as a battlefield commander, Santa Anna was tireless. He seemed to be everywhere at once, rallying troops, supervising construction, and planning the destruction of the Yankee invaders. On August 7th, Scott's army began its final advance. The soldiers marched through high mountain passes, past snow-capped volcanoes, and down into the Valley of Mexico, the ancient heartland of Aztec civilization, where Tenochtitlan had once risen from the waters of Lake Texcoco. By mid-August, the Americans were on the outskirts of Mexico City. Between them and the capital lay a series of fortified positions, each of which would have to be stormed. The endgame had begun. The battles for Mexico City rank among the most dramatic and bloody engagements in American military history before the Civil War. Over a period of 3 weeks in August and September 1847, Scott's army fought its way through one defensive position after another, suffering thousands of casualties and never losing momentum. The first major obstacle was a complex of fortifications at Contreras and Churubusco, south of the city. On August 19th to 20th, Scott attacked both positions simultaneously, using the same flanking tactics that had worked at Cerro Gordo. The fighting at Churubusco was especially savage partly because among the Mexican defenders was the St. Patrick's Battalion, a unit composed of Irish immigrants who had deserted from the American army to fight for Catholic Mexico. The San Patricios, as they were called, fought with the desperation of men who knew that capture meant execution. They manned their cannons until the ammunition ran out, then fought with bayonets and rocks. When the position finally fell, 72 survivors were taken prisoner. Most would be hanged as traitors in the weeks that followed, in mass executions that remained controversial for decades. By the evening of August 20th, the southern approaches to Mexico City had been breached. Scott's army had suffered approximately 1,000 casualties. Mexico had lost perhaps for times that number plus thousands captured. Santa Anna requested an armistice to negotiate. The armistice lasted 2 weeks and accomplished nothing. Santa Anna used the time to strengthen his remaining fortifications and reorganize his battered army. Scott, realizing he had been played, terminated the ceasefire on September 7th and prepared for the final assault. 2 positions still blocked the approaches to the city, a fortified mill called Molino del Rey, and the hill of Chapultepec, crowned by a massive stone castle that served as Mexico's military academy. The attack on Molino del Rey on September 8th was one of Scott's worst mistakes of the campaign. Believing the position lightly defended, he ordered a frontal assault that ran straight into prepared defenses. The Americans took the position, but at a cost of nearly 800 casualties, more than any other single engagement of the war. The victory was so expensive that it felt like a defeat. Chapultepec would be different. The castle of Chapultepec rises 200 feet above the surrounding plain, its walls dominating the causeways that led into Mexico City. It was a formidable position, manned by approximately 1,000 soldiers and, famously, by the cadets of the Mexican Military Academy teenagers who had refused to evacuate when given the chance. On September 12th, American artillery began a day-long bombardment of the castle. The stone walls absorbed much of the punishment, but the psychological effect on the defenders was devastating. By nightfall, everyone knew the assault would come at dawn. On the morning of September 13th, Scott's infantry advanced. They crossed the open ground under heavy fire, planted scaling ladders against the walls, and climbed into the teeth of the Mexican defense. The fighting was hand-to-hand, room to room, with no quarter asked or given. Within 90 minutes, the American flag flew over Chapultepec. The legend of Los Niños Heroes, the boy heroes, was born in that assault. According to Mexican tradition, 6 teenage cadets died defending the castle, the youngest only 13 years old. One of them, Juan Escutia, supposedly wrapped himself in the Mexican flag and leapt from the castle walls rather than allow the banner to be captured by the enemy. The American flag flying over the National Palace in Mexico City presented President Polk with an unexpected problem. He had won the war too thoroughly. There was no functioning Mexican government left to negotiate with. Santa Anna had fled into exile again, and the political chaos that had plagued Mexico for decades reached new heights. Rival factions fought for control of whatever authority remained. Some Mexican leaders wanted to continue guerrilla resistance indefinitely. Others wanted to negotiate the best terms possible before the Americans decided to take everything. And there were voices in the United States arguing for exactly that. The All-Mexico movement gained surprising traction in the months following the fall of Mexico City. Newspapers editorialized that the United States should simply annex the entire country, every state, every province, every square mile from the Rio Grande to the Guatemalan border. Manifest destiny, they argued, demanded nothing less. God had clearly ordained American dominion over the entire continent. Why stop at half? The arguments in favor of taking all of Mexico were seductive in their simplicity. The war had proven that Mexico couldn't defend itself. The country was rich in resources and strategically positioned. American governance would bring order, prosperity, and civilization to a nation that had known nothing but chaos since independence. But there were counter-arguments, and they were rooted in something uglier than high-minded principle. Many Americans opposed annexing all of Mexico because they didn't want millions of Mexicans becoming American citizens. The racial attitudes of the 1840s were explicit in ways that would be shocking today. Senators and congressmen openly argued that Mexicans were racially inferior, incapable of self-government, and unsuitable for incorporation into the American body politic. John C. Calhoun, the South Carolina senator and arch-defender of slavery, put it bluntly, "We have never dreamt of incorporating into our union any but the Caucasian race, the free white race. Taking all of Mexico would mean absorbing a majority mestizo population that could never, in Calhoun's view, be made truly American." So the racism that had helped justify the conquest in the first place now served to limit its extent. The United States would take the land it wanted, the sparsely populated northern territories, while leaving the densely populated heartland of Mexico to govern itself. It was colonialism with a conscience, or perhaps colonialism with a different kind of prejudice. The man tasked with negotiating the peace treaty was Nicholas Trist, a State Department official whom Polk had sent to Mexico months earlier. Trist was an interesting choice, a Virginia aristocrat, former personal secretary to Andrew Jackson, and married to Thomas Jefferson's granddaughter. He was also, as it turned out, a man with a mind of his own. Trist's instructions were clear: negotiate the acquisition of California and New Mexico, establish the Rio Grande as the border of Texas, and pay Mexico a reasonable sum in compensation. Polk wanted the treaty done quickly, before political circumstances in either country could complicate matters. But as the months dragged on and negotiations stalled, Polk grew impatient. By November 1847, he had lost confidence in Trist and sent orders recalling him to Washington. The president would find another negotiator, one who might drive a harder bargain. Trist received the recall order in mid-November. And then he did something remarkable. He ignored it. Trist had been negotiating with Mexican officials for months. He understood the fragility of the political situation and the genuine risk that continued delay might cause the moderate Mexican faction to collapse, potentially leading 2 years of guerrilla warfare. He also believed correctly, as it turned out, that the terms he was negotiating were fair and that any delay would only make things worse. So Nicholas Trist, a mid-level diplomat with no authority whatsoever, continued negotiating a treaty that would transfer half a continent from one nation to another. He justified his insubordination in a lengthy letter to the Secretary of State, arguing that the national interest demanded he complete his mission regardless of his personal orders. It was either a profound act of statesmanship or an outrageous example of bureaucratic insubordination, depending on your perspective. Polk was furious. He would later refuse to pay Trist's salary or expenses for the period after his recall. But by then, the treaty was signed. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was concluded on February 2, 1848, in a shrine near Mexico City that had witnessed the apparition of the Virgin of Guadalupe 3 centuries earlier. The location was symbolically important to the Mexican negotiators, a reminder that even in defeat, Mexico retained its spiritual identity and cultural continuity. The terms were devastating nonetheless. Mexico ceded to the United States all of Alta California and Nuevo Mexico, the entire northern third of the country. This included not just the modern states of California, Nevada, and Utah, but most of Arizona and New Mexico, plus significant portions of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. The Rio Grande was confirmed as the border of Texas, ending the territorial dispute that had ostensibly caused the war. Mexico gave up any claim to the land between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. In exchange, the United States agreed to pay Mexico $15 million, roughly equivalent to $300 million in today's money, though such comparisons are inherently imprecise. The United States also assumed approximately $3.25 million in debts that Mexico owed to American citizens. Additionally, the treaty guaranteed that Mexicans living in the ceded territories could either relocate to Mexico or remain and become American citizens with full constitutional rights. Their property would be protected, their land grants would be honored, their culture and religion would be respected. These guarantees would be honored mostly in the breach. The history of Mexican Americans in the conquered territories over the following decades is a story of dispossession, discrimination, and broken promises. But on paper, at least, the treaty offered protections that the negotiators on both sides considered meaningful. When the treaty reached Washington, Polk faced a dilemma. He desperately wanted the territory that Trist had secured. But accepting a treaty negotiated by a recalled diplomat would set a dangerous precedent. It would suggest that American officials could ignore orders and still have their work ratified. Polk's cabinet was divided. Secretary of State James Buchanan, the future president, wanted to reject the treaty and send a new negotiator with instructions to demand even more territory. Others argued that the political situation was too unstable to risk further delay. In the end, pragmatism won. Polk submitted the treaty to the Senate with a message that carefully avoided endorsing Trist's conduct while recommending the terms he had negotiated. The Senate debated for 2 weeks, with some members arguing for more territory and others for less. But on March 10, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was ratified by a vote of 38 to 14. Mexico ratified the treaty on May 25, despite significant opposition from those who considered any cession of territory a national humiliation. The war was officially over. The United States had grown by approximately 525,000 square miles, an area larger than France, Germany, and the United Kingdom combined. The nation now stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, its continental destiny fulfilled. And the $15 million that America paid for this vast territory. It was less than what the federal government spent on the war itself. The conquest had essentially been free. The immediate aftermath of the war was triumphant for the United States and catastrophic for Mexico. In America, the returning soldiers were greeted as heroes. Zachary Taylor, as Polk had feared, parlayed his military fame into a successful presidential campaign, winning the 1848 election for the Whigs. The general who had won at Buena Vista would become the 12th president of the United States. He would also die in office after just 16 months, but that's another story. Winfield Scott, despite his more impressive strategic achievements, never achieved the presidency he coveted. His pomposity and political missteps made him unelectable, though he would receive the Whig nomination in 1852 and lose in a landslide to Franklin Pierce. For Mexico, the war was a national trauma that would shape the country's politics and psyche for generations. The loss of half the national territory was humiliating beyond measure. The ease with which the Americans had marched to Mexico City exposed the hollowness of Mexican military power and the dysfunction of Mexican politics. In the years following the war, Mexico descended into even deeper chaos. Civil wars, foreign interventions, and political instability became the norm. It would take decades and another round of American intervention during the French occupation of the 1860s before Mexico began to stabilize under the long dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. The war also left a legacy of bitterness that has never entirely faded. In Mexican historical memory, the Mexican-American War is remembered as La Intervención Estadounidense, the American intervention, or simply as a war of conquest and robbery. The phrase Pobre Mexico, tan lejos de Dios y tan cerca de Estados Unidos por Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States, became a national proverb, encapsulating a relationship defined by power imbalance and resentment. But the most consequential legacy of the Mexican-American War played out not in Mexico, but in the United States itself. The vast territories acquired from Mexico reopened a question that the American political system had desperately tried to avoid: the question of slavery. Every state that entered the Union had to be designated as either free or slave. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had established a geographic line 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude, dividing future states into free and slave zones. This compromise had maintained the balance of power between North and South for a generation, but the Mexican cession threw everything into chaos. The new territories lay largely below the Missouri Compromise line, which would suggest they should be open to slavery. But many Northerners, including those who had supported the war, adamantly opposed the expansion of slavery into any new territory. The Wilmot Proviso, introduced by a Pennsylvania congressman even before the war ended, would have banned slavery from any territory acquired from Mexico. It passed the House repeatedly, but always failed in the Senate. The debate it sparked revealed the depth of sectional tension that the war had unleashed. For the next 13 years, American politics would be dominated by the question of slavery in the Western territories. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott decision. Each attempted solution only deepened the divide. Each failed compromise brought the nation closer to rupture. Ulysses Grant, looking back on his service in Mexico, drew a direct line between the War of Conquest and the catastrophe that followed. The Southern Rebellion was largely the outgrowth of the Mexican War. Nations, like individuals, are punished for their transgressions. We got our punishment in the most sanguinary and expensive war of modern times. Grant believed that the Civil War was divine retribution for the sin of the Mexican-American War, that America had stolen half a continent and paid for it with 600,000 lives. It's a powerful interpretation, though not everyone would agree with its theological underpinnings. What seems undeniable is the causal connection. The Mexican-American War provided the territorial spark that ignited the sectional powder keg. Without the Mexican cession, the slavery debate would have remained theoretical, abstract, contained. With it, the debate became immediate, concrete, and ultimately irresolvable through politics. The blood spilled at Buena Vista and Chapultepec led, by a crooked but traceable path, to the blood spilled at Antietam and Gettysburg. There is one more piece of this story that deserves attention, Dakota, that occurred 5 years after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In 1853, the United States acquired an additional strip of territory from Mexico through the Gadsden Purchase. This was a relatively small acquisition, about 30,000 square miles in what is now southern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico, purchased for $10 million. The primary motivation for the Gadsden Purchase was practical. The territory included the best route for a potential southern transcontinental railroad. But the purchase also demonstrated that Mexico's ordeal was not quite over, that the United States could return whenever it wanted more. And there were those who wanted more. Throughout the 1850s, American filibusters, private military adventurers, launched unauthorized invasions of Mexican territory, dreaming of new conquests and new slave states. William Walker briefly conquered Nicaragua. Henry Crabb invaded Sonora and was executed by Mexican forces. These expeditions failed, but they reflected a strand of American expansionism that considered the Mexican-American War merely the first installment of an ongoing project. The Civil War ended those dreams. The defeat of the Confederacy discredited the expansionist, pro-slavery ideology that had driven much of the pressure for Southern acquisitions. The United States turned inward, focused on reconstruction and reconciliation, and the age of continental conquest came to an end. But the borders that the Mexican-American War established remained. They remain today the longest international border in the Western Hemisphere, stretching nearly 2,000 miles from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. What are we to make of all this? How should we judge a war that shaped North America so profoundly, that created the modern geography of two nations, that set in motion events whose consequences we still live with today? The defenders of the Mexican-American War, then and now, argue that it was inevitable, that the sweep of manifest destiny was unstoppable, that the sparsely populated Mexican territories would have fallen into American hands one way or another, that the war simply accelerated a process that geography and demography had already determined. There is some truth to this. American settlers were flooding into Texas, California, and Oregon regardless of what any government decreed. The Mexican state was too weak, too distant, too preoccupied with its own internal conflicts to effectively govern its northern frontier. In an age of imperial expansion, when European powers were carving up Africa and Asia, it would have been surprising if the United States had refrained from expansion on its own continent. But inevitability is a convenient excuse for those who benefit from the outcome. The fact that something might have happened eventually does not justify making it happen through force and fraud. The Mexican-American War was not a natural disaster or a historical inevitability. It was a choice made by specific individuals for specific reasons. Polk chose to send troops into disputed territory. Polk chose to interpret a border skirmish as an act of war. Polk chose to demand terms that no Mexican government could accept without political suicide. At every decision point, there were alternatives. They were not chosen. The critics of the war, and there were many, even at the time, saw clearly what was happening. Abraham Lincoln's spot resolutions, Henry David Thoreau's civil disobedience, the abolitionists who called it a slaveholders' conspiracy, the Whig congressman who voted for war supplies while denouncing the war itself. They understood that the United States was waging a war of aggression, and they said so. They were ignored. They were mocked. They were politically marginalized, and they were right. Today, the lands that were taken from Mexico are home to over 60 million Americans. Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Denver, cities that define modern America, stand on ground that was Mexican soil less than 2 centuries ago. The people who live in these places are, for the most part, unaware of this history. The Mexican-American War is a footnote in American textbooks, mentioned briefly between the War of 1812 and the Civil War. It lacks the moral clarity of the Revolution, the drama of the Civil War, or the global scope of the World Wars. It is simply there a war that happened, that resulted in territory gained, that can be noted and moved past. But for Mexico, the wound never fully healed. The war remains a defining national memory, a reminder of vulnerability and loss, a source of ongoing tension with the Colossus to the north. The phrase "Remember the Alamo" echoes through American history as a call to courage and vengeance. In Mexico, there is a corresponding phrase, unspoken but deeply felt: "Remember what they took from us." And perhaps that is the final lesson of the Mexican-American War. Victory and defeat look very different depending on which side of the border you stand. The same events that appear as triumph in one national narrative appear as tragedy in another. The same land that represents opportunity for some represents dispossession for others. The United States took half of Mexico in 2 years. It paid $15 million. It called the war justified, the peace honorable, the outcome beneficial to both nations. Mexico lost half its territory in 2 years. It received $15 million. It called the war unjust, the peace humiliating, the outcome a catastrophe from which the nation would take generations to recover. Both of these stories are true. Neither cancels the other. They exist side by side, as they have for nearly 200 years, in the shared and contested history of two nations bound together by geography, immigration, trade, and the memory of a war that one side remembers as destiny and the other remembers as theft. The border that runs through deserts and rivers and cities, the border that defines so much of contemporary politics. The border that people cross and die crossing every day. That border was drawn in blood in 1848. Understanding how it got there and what it meant to those on both sides is essential to understanding how we got here.